Let's go ahead and resume. I think we have some of the folks back. Okay. Let me zoom in here. Okay, here we go. So we're gonna keep the ball rolling. So what I was explaining before, we broke. I have the this table that is actually showing you the plan that the team has to implement and produce the product increment for the sprint. This is part of the sprint backlog. So you can see that on the high level, you have those features to develop for that specific sprint. And under each of them, you have tasks, right? And each task is assigned to an owner that is part of the dev team, okay? And every day we're tracking the progress of those tasks, right? And whenever we complete those, we're moving the tasks from in progress or pending to done. In this case, it's pending, from pending to done, right? Now, once you complete a story, and I was telling you, if it's a 5-point story, then you just took 5 points off of your total number of points for the sprint. And your burn down chart is going to move 5 story points down. So if you have 80, the day you complete that feature, that first feature of 5 points, you're going to have 75 remaining. And your chart is going to have a slope a little bit downward, right? Showing you that you only have 75 points left. As you keep completing those stories, you're going to see that slope going down, right? And every day you're tracking the progress and you have an estimate of how long, how much time you have left on the task, okay? Now, I was thinking when I showed you before in Jira what the backlog looks like, the product backlog and the sprint backlog, I thought I did not include the other image, right? So this is what the sprint backlog looks like when you get to the dashboard, right? I was showing you that if you click on this option and you started your sprint, this is the sprint goal. That's how it's going to show. So every time you're clicking on this option in Jira is showing you the active sprints, right? Because a lot of company, the table I showed you, or the picture I showed you before, a lot of company have multiple sprints that they plan ahead, and that's actually a good habit when you're working in a Scrum of safe environment where you have multiple Scrum teams working on the same project and having dependencies. So what big companies are trying to do is when they have a project on which multiple Scrum teams are working, they create multiple sprints in advance, and they do move sprint backlog items from the product backlog to those sprints. So they plan in advance, but they only start one sprint at the time because you can only work on one sprint at the time as a Scrum team, okay? So in this case, I showed you only an example of one team that had one sprint backlog that they were planning for, okay? And if you click on the active sprint, it's going to show you what is the current sprint that you're working on and what are the product backlog items that are in it and what are their statuses, okay? So in our example, the sprint that we are on was for Mars landing. So that was the goal, okay? And initially, this is what it's going to really look like, all those user stories, right? And as you move in them, you start working on them, you're going to be moving them in the swim lane, the in progress swim lane. This is a swim lane, okay? So column. In Jira, we call them swim lanes. So you're going to be moving all the different user stories that you started working on in the swim lanes. Now, you have the opportunity of breaking those down, those tasks, and down and showing them here. There's a way of doing that. You can't just see it here. So this is showing you only at the user story level, but you can configure this dashboard to be having the tasks on each of those features, on each of those items. So in other words, for this specific user story, you would have those 5 tasks or 6 tasks, right? And there's a way of actually configuring your sprint backlog dashboard to be able to click on this user story and seeing all the different tasks that are under that story and their statuses as well. So you can move those tasks to from in this case it was from to do to pending to done as well, right? And usually when you complete all the only when you complete all the tasks under one item or one user story, then you move it to done or to complete. Okay. And in their case, the way this snapshot is showing, they have 2 items that are currently working on in their sprint backlog. They still have those 5 that they need to start, and they have 3 that they completed. Okay, and this is changing and it's updated every day. And when you do this in Jira, somebody was asking about the velocity on those charts. Jira, like who creates those charts? I was telling you that Jira is actually on the background creating all those different graphs for you because it tracks the behavior of your board and how fast you're completing the task. And at the end, you can go under the reporting option and pull your burn down chart or your velocity chart, and even daily you can check your burn down chart because you need to check that every day. Okay, it's really, really simple. Okay, so that's an example of a sprint backlog dashboard in Jira. Okay, questions? All right. So the last artifact, Scrum artifact that we have is the increment, the product increment. Okay. So the increment, that's another tricky question. The increment is the sum of all the different product backlog items that have been worked before, plus the product backlog items that are completed for the current sprint. Okay, that's what the product increment is. Some people usually get tricked by thinking that the product increment is only what was designed and built for the specific sprint or the current sprint. No, any sprint that you go through is actually using as an input the previous product increment, which is the sum of all the work that you did on all the previous sprints, and you just add to it. So the current sprint that you're working on, you take that as an input, you add all your work for the sprint backlog items that you selected, and then at the end, you integrate that together and you deliver the next product increment. Okay, so it's a sum of all the work that was done before plus the work that you're doing for this sprint. That's what the product increment is. Okay, so at the end of the sprint, the increment must be done according to the Scrum team definition of done. Okay, I was telling you that we're going to talk about the definition of done a couple of slides down. So the definition of done is I'm gonna show you a slide where we talk about it in details, but again, just to give you a high level definition once again for you to understand what that sentence means, is the list of criteria that a user story or a product increment need to fulfill for that product increment to be deemed as done. That's what the definition of done is. And that's something that the Scrum team is sitting down and is defining. And they can review that during the retrospective meeting, right? And make some changes or updates or remove stuff, add stuff, okay? So I was telling you the product increment is a piece of the product that has to be in the releasable and workable condition at any time, okay? Meaning if it is done, it means that potentially that's something that if we decide to go in production with tomorrow, we can do it without problem. Okay, it should be in a usable condition regardless of whether the product owner decides to actually release it or not. And that's something that I was emphasizing yesterday. I was telling you every product increment need to be in releasable condition, but it doesn't mean that the product owner is going to release that product increment in production. okay? But it needs to be in a releasable condition, okay? So what I explained to the side one number of sprint that you have. So every time you're creating a sprint, you have something that is out, and you see that every time that you're producing the next product increment is getting bigger. Why? Because everything that you designed before gets into what you're designing now as an input. You add to it, you integrate it, and then it gives you your next product increment. So the first, normally this sprint I should have had something here because every sprint you need to produce a product increment, okay? So you should have something that you started with, and then you build it, you produce it, and then you add to whatever you had on sprint 1 and 2, it gives you your product increment plus what you do for the sprint 3, and it gives you your product increments for the sprint 3. Once you're done with that, you have as an input of sprint 4, you have the product increment of sprint 3. And then you do the work for sprint 4, you add to it, and it gives you the product increment for sprint 4. And then as you're going through sprints, the product increment is getting bigger. Okay, so that's really fundamental. A product increment is the work that you're doing for the current sprint plus all the work that you did before is the sum. Okay. All right, so the definition of done is a formal description of the state of the increment when it meets the quality measures required for the product. Okay, it's a set of criteria created by the Scrum team that is used to decide whether or not the product backlog item is done. Okay. And a funny example that I'm just thinking about is, let's say you have kids home, right? And you're telling them you can go to sleep when you're done eating. Okay. Now, you need to have a definition of done, because maybe to you, the definition of done of being done eating is you need to finish your food, you need to wipe your mouth, you need to clean your plates or wash your plates, and only then you can say that you're done eating. Okay, so that would be your definition of done. If the kid is not completing all that, then he did not finish eating. Okay, so the same thing goes for any feature that we release. And the Scrum team is the one who is sitting down and decides what are the items or the criteria that we're putting in our definition of done for each and every feature that we release or that we create. Okay, an example in a software development would be this, right? You see, every time you're completing something, you can have a checklist where you're clicking, okay, this is completed. We've done the code and it's merged on the master branch in Bitbucket, for example. The code is also peer reviewed, right? There's no issue. We did the code review and all that. All the automation tests are passed. And then you can the change passed the manual test as well. And then the quality gate passes, and then the documentation is updated. So you can have multiple criteria that you, as a team, as a Scrum team, you decide to put in place in your definition of done. Okay, and until you complete all those, then your feature or your item is not done, and therefore you cannot put that in the product increment. Okay, and most of the time, people are really good at following that, but some teams who do not apply the Scrum framework accurately, sometimes maybe because of the pressure from the management, which is not correct, or they have a hierarchy such as maybe the customer has more power than he should have. Sometimes they decide that, okay, if they did maybe 90% of what is on the definition of done list, then they can go ahead and say that the item is done, right? And that's a mistake, because it's going to come back tomorrow and bite you in the butt, especially if you release that in production, right? So every time you're completing an item during your sprint, you need to make sure that all the items or the criteria in your definition of done are checked, are completed. before going ahead and releasing your product increment. Okay. Any question? All right. So let's talk about the burn down chart right now. Okay. So the burn down chart is it's a very simple chart that is built from your activity during the sprint. Okay. And you can also have release burn down chart. It's working the same way, but ultimately the tool that you're using to manage your work, right, using the Scrum framework is actually going to build that for you as you're working through sprints. Okay. You just need to produce it, to have an option to click on it and produce it, and it's going to show that to you. Okay. So the sprint burn down chart, like I said before, is a chart that is tracking the amount of work that you're completing every day and what is left. So it allows you to visualize how many stories you completed and actually how many are left. Okay. The burn up chart is showing you on a graph how many you already have completed only. And the burn down is showing you how many is left, how many stories are left or story points are left. Okay. And the two charts actually, if you do some calculation, you can actually figure out the information on each of those charts easily. So you can get from the burn down chart, you know, from how many stories is left or story points are left, you can know how many you already completed, right? And from the burn up chart, from how many user stories points you completed, you can know how many are left. Okay. But most of the time companies use the burn down chart, and I'm going to show you what it looks like, both looks like. And one variation of that is a release burn down chart, right? So who can tell me what's the difference between a sprint burn down chart and a release burn down chart? What's the difference?
I would say that the release burn down chart will actually track the amount of work left before an actual release.
Exactly right. That's exactly right. So I showed you before the iceberg that the product backlog iceberg that was showing the sprint work at the top. In the middle, it was showing you the release work, right? And then at the bottom, it was showing the work that is not scheduled yet. Okay. So usually the product owner in advance decide on the release dates. So they know upfront when they're going to be releasing any product increment in production, right? So I was telling you the other day that some companies are going monthly, they're releasing in production monthly. Some people are going quarterly, so every 3 months. Okay. So let's say your release is every 3 months, right? So, and your sprint is 2 weeks, right? That means that you have approximately 6 sprints before release, right? So therefore, you can create a burn down chart as you're completing sprints that is showing you the number of points that you have for all the release for the release to happen, right? Since you have your capacity maybe is 80 points per sprint, right? It means that technically you should be able to take 480 points per release, right? So all the stories or the product backlog items that you select for the release, the sum of it should be around that 480, right? And as you completing sprints, you're burning 80 points every time, and it shows you on the graph on the horizontal. It's going to show you the sprint after every sprint, how many points you have left before the release. So if you have 480 initially for the first release, and you start the first sprint, and on the first sprint you complete your 80 points, then it's going to be 400 left, right? And then when you complete the second sprint, you're going to have what? 380 left. So that's how you build the release burn down chart. So it shows you how much progress you're making toward the release. So how many story points are left to be completed before the release happens? Does that make sense? All right, so this is a simple illustration of a burned out chart. And you can see that on the horizontal axis, you do have the days. And on the vertical axis, you do have the number of points, okay, that you took on. So in their case, this team for which this chart was designed, initially they accepted 90 points, right, for this sprint. So that's why on day one, when they start, they have 90 points to complete. And then maybe on day two, you can see that they have maybe 75 points left. It means that they completed 15 points, right? That's what I was telling you. From the burned out chart, you can figure out the burn up charts information. So how many points were completed, okay? So on this graph, it shows you how the team, how many points they completed and how many were left over. To produce this graph, you need to take into account how many points are left. So after 2 days, they completed 15 points. So they have 75 left. Third day, they have almost like 62 left, etc., etc., etc. So this is the actual line, right? That is showing what the team is realizing. But this blue line is the expected. That's basically the baseline or the perfect line, but nobody is ever following this line because it just shows if the team was doing the work at a constant pace, this is what their burn down chart will look like. But it's not really possible because you cannot complete exactly the same amount of points every day, right? Some days you're probably going to be completing 10 points. Some days you're going to be completing 15. Some days you're going to be completing 8, right? But this chart is kind of the baseline and it's showing you the pace, the standard pace at which you would normally complete your sprint, right? So in this case, you're seeing that the slope is constant and you do have 10 points approximately every day. They're completing 10 points every day on this expected line. But like I said, almost no team can have the same amount of points completed every single day. It varies. That's why you do have the actual graph that looks like this. And in some, not that in the PSM, it makes sense, but on the job, the way you really read this to get more information is also by seeing if the your team, your dev team is moving faster or is moving slower, if they are ahead or if they are late, right? For example, let me ask you this question. So who can, from looking at the graphs, right, who can show me when during the sprint the dev team was actually moving faster and when they were moving, they were late, basically, and they were moving slower. So when were they ahead and when were they behind? Looking at this graph.
From the 5th day to the 7th, almost 8th, in the slowdown.
So from the 5th day to the 7th day. So you're saying they were ahead or they were behind?
Yeah, they went above the expectation.
They were behind.
No.
No, they were above.
They
And
were above
yeah.
the expectation.
They were
Yeah,
behind from day 1 to day 4 and from day 8 to the end, I think.
I think it's the opposite.
It's the opposite.
Every time the actual graph is on top of the expected
They're
graph,
behind.
they're behind. And every time it's below,
They're moving
they're
fast.
ahead of it.
Oh, really?
That's correct.
Yes.
Okay.
That's correct.
Because you can track down on the number of days. Like let's say day 1, they were actually on point. Day 2, we can say day 2 until day 3 they were ahead because they're releasing quicker than the actual graph.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
Another way to look at it is at the end of day 1, the expectation was that they would be at 82. But in actuality, they were down to 74.
70.
So they actually
Yes.
completed more work.
Yep.
That's exactly right. I mean, you guys said
Okay.
everything.
Yes.
Does that make sense for you?
Yes. Yes. Thank you.
Yeah, Denise. Okay, no problem. So I mean, that's exactly how you look at it, and this is a burn down chart that is showed at the end of the sprint, right? So because I just want to have all the data points put in for you to visualize how a sprint can evolve, right? But initially, you don't have all those points, so it's just getting marked every day. So after they passes, there's a new point that is added. This line, this blue line, the expected line is actually, you know what is expected, technically supposed to be expected, even though you never match that line. It's already drawn in, right? Because you know how many points you want to complete the sprint, and you know how long you have, so how many days you have in the sprint. If it's a 2 weeks, so 2 weeks in 5 working days, that's 10 days, right? So initially, you only have that blue line, and after the day and this only point that is put in here, and after the first day, you do have a second point that is plugged in here. After the third day, you have another one, right? So that's why I was telling you, in the daily stand-up, you can look at this graph as it's getting built, but it's not going to be fully completed till you have the last day of your sprint, right? In this case, it's day 10. Okay, but yeah, that's a very good answer from Jacques and Jorgen. So good job. Any other question on this chart? Okay, so on the opposite side, you do have the burn up chart, right? And it carries almost the same information, but in the opposite way, right? So the burn down chart is showing you how many points you already, how many points is left for you to finish up with the sprint, the number of points. But the burn up is showing you how many points you already completed, right, as the day passes. So in this case, on the first day shows you completed almost 25 points, right? On the second day, you completed 52, right? On the third day, you completed 75, etc., etc. So just carry the same information, and from there, you can decide how many points you have. In this case, at the end, I guess that's not the end. The end is the 8 days, so they probably have 8 days in the sprint, right? It's 250, right? So you can decide to calculate how many points are left, and from this graph, you can actually design the burn down chart, and from the burn down chart, you can design the burn up chart. So it carries the same information, but in different ways. Okay, and most of the time, companies are using the burn down chart. Most of the companies are using the burn down chart. Okay. All right, so this is the velocity chart, and now it's time to talk about again and again the velocity. And I spoke about that a couple of times yesterday. You probably understand that already. So the velocity, I was telling you yesterday, and I think I even showed this slide, and then I went back up. The velocity is on average how many story points the dev team is completing every sprint. And I was telling you, most of the time, people are taking the average of the past 3 sprints to calculate the team's velocity. Some people are taking the last sprint number of points to decide what's the velocity of the team for the next sprint, okay? Or to plan for it. And that velocity is becoming the capacity of the team normally. Now, there is a difference, though, between the velocity and the capacity. What's the difference? What's the difference between the dev team velocity and the dev team capacity? Anyone?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
What's the difference between the dev team capacity and the dev team velocity? What's the difference?
Okay, so you've seen that the capacity is actually the way that the team is available. I mean, how many people can complete the task if there is any holidays, this kind of thing. And the velocity is more about how we think, the way that we can rate give a rate to how we can complete a task. And you've said that it's about, for a team, it takes like 2 to 3 sprints to have like a basis of velocity, and to know if the team is about to complete the number of points that is, I don't know if it's the right term, but how the number of points that is selected. So let's say that in the last sprint, we've made the 80 points. We're trying to make the 80 points to the sprint +1, something like that. This is my understanding, I mean.
Yeah, I think you're close to the answer, but I'm just going to add a few things to what you said. So the velocity is basically a measure of the measure of the capacity of the team, but is a tool that is used to plan for the team's capacity, right? So let's say you finished up sprint 1, 2, and 3, and you're trying to decide what's the capacity, what's the velocity of the team, right? Some people are going to average the number of points that were completed during those 3 sprints, right? In this case, it's going to be what? 5 plus 6, that's 11, plus 16, that's 27. Okay, divided by 3, that's 9. So it would be 9 if you're trying to forecast the capacity of the team based on the velocity. The velocity is going to be 9, right? If you're using the last sprint as a measure of the velocity, then you will say that the velocity is 5, because that's how many points they completed during that sprint. Now, that's for the velocity. It helps you forecasting the capacity of the team. Now, you said something that is interesting, and that is actually correct. The capacity of the team may vary depending on what's happening with the team on the sprint, right? For example, we might be in a situation where people are taking off. They're going for holidays, right? So let's say usually the team completes, let's say 20 points every sprint, right? And let's say 4 people and they complete 5 points every sprint, okay? And one specific sprint, 2 people are out, right? Their velocity is normally 20 points. But since 2 people, that means 5 points per person. But now, since people are out for that sprint, what's the team capacity? It's 10, right? So they won't be able to take more than 10 points, because people are going to be, for the next 2 weeks of that sprint, people are taking some day off, for example. So that's the team capacity. So the team capacity is actually how much the team can take on during a sprint, given the availability and other measure, if there's a holiday, if there's anything, right? So that's the capacity of the team. It's how much work they can feasibly take given the availability of the team members, okay? But the velocity can be used to forecast that capacity, right? Because you can, if the team is working, everybody's working, then you would say their capacity is 20, right? But now if you have 20 normally, and then you know, okay, some folks are going to be out, it reduces your capacity. So your velocity doesn't equal your capacity anymore. Does that make sense? Questions? Okay. So now this is also an extract from how Jira produces the velocity chart, right? That's exactly what it looks like. That's actually from Jira. Okay. So it's going to show you what is expected, or what is committed, and what you actually completed. Because it's possible that if a team's capacity is 20, or velocity is 20, or capacity is 20, I should say, right? They commit up to 20 points. So let's say they take 4 stories of 5 points to be worked into that sprint, right? Sometimes things might happen where they cannot complete the work. So they can only complete maybe 3 of those stories. So that means that they will complete only 16 points, or 15 points instead of 20. So in this graph in Jira, when you try to plug in the velocity chart, it's going to show 15 completed and 20 committed and 15 completed. Okay. All right, we're going to stop now. Tomorrow is the final day. Okay, so we should be completed with the whole thing. Thanks for joining. I'll talk to you tomorrow.